Modern Government. An e-content prepared for the Department of Collegiate Education, Government of Karnataka, by Dr. Satish Naik, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Government First Grade College, Sirsi. Program BA. Subject Political Science, Paper 2. Semester 5th. University, Karnataka University, Dharwad, Session 18. Republic of China. The Premier of the People's Republic of China. The Premier is the head of the State Council. China's 1982 constitution reinforces the powers and status of the Premier than the 1978 constitution. The Premier of the State Council is the People's Republic of China. Sometimes also referred to informally as the Prime Minister is the head of the central government of China and the Premier is the highest rank in the civil service. This position replaced the role of Premier of the Government Administration Council of the Central People's Government. It is existed from 1949 to 54. The Premier is the Chief of Executive and is responsible for the performance of the executive. The Premier is formally approved by the National People's Congress upon the nomination of the President. In practice, the candidate is chosen within the Communist Party of China through the same process that determines the composition of the CPC Central Politburo. The Premier has always been a member of the powerful Politburo Standing Committee, renewable once in 5 years. The Premier must not serve more than two consecutive terms. The current Premier is in the second term after completing the first term. The National People's Congress has the power to remove the Premier, according to Article 63. The President is constitutionally empowered to overthrow the Premier. The Premier is the highest administrative position in the government of China. The Premier is responsible for organizing and administering the Chinese civil bureaucracy. The Premier is tasked with planning and implementing national economic, social development, and the state budget. This includes overseeing the various ministries, departments, commissions, and statutory agencies and announcing their candidates to the National People's Congress for Vice Premier, State Councillors, and ministerial offices. The Premier is the head of the National Defense Mobilization Commission of China and deputy head of the National Security Commission, which are the departments of the armed force. Since 1980, there has been a division of responsibilities between the Premier and the General Secretary of the Communist Party, wherein the Premier is responsible for the technical details of implementing government policy. The Premier heads of the State Council. He directs and coordinates the work of the councillors and the vice premiers. The vice premiers, the state councillors, and the secretary general always assist the premier. As head of the real government and the real executive, the Premier plays an active role in formulating the policies of the state. He conducts the foreign relations of China and represents China in the international conferences he attends. Civil affairs, foreign relation affairs, state defense, national issues, interest of foreign nationals, geographical divisions, martial law implementation, etc. These are the matters that the State Council will review and determine before the Premier. The Premier's power and responsibilities are codified into the Constitution like the Prime Minister from as by convention or traditions. The office of the Premier is a powerful office because of his headship of the real government which is called State Council. The 1982 Constitution it has made the Premier powerful by giving it the headship of the real executive and by vesting it with the overall responsibility regarding the effective working of the State Council. The premier position is the head of the State Council. Further, makes his role very powerful and active in working of the Chinese government. The position of the Premier of China is not as powerful as the Prime Minister's position in the parliamentary system in India. The Chinese Premier is powerful largely because of his powerful position in the Communist Party. He is the most important person in the State Council and one of the two or three most powerful communist leaders of the Chinese political system. The former premier's post was strengthened after the 1982 constitution, but the post of premier depends on the strong personality of the person who becomes premier. Although the premier is a great politician, he is also barred after two terms. The premier exerts his ideas, views, and personality on the State Council of China, and the Chinese premier is always a powerful and active person in the Chinese political system. Who is the head of the State of Council of China? Premier. Who is the head of the National Defense Mobilization Commission of China? That is the Premier. Who has constitutionally empowered to overthrow the Premier? The President. Who is the present Premier of China? Li Qiang. The Premier must not serve more than two consecutive terms, that is 10 years. Who is responsible for organizing and administering the Chinese civil bureaucracy? It is the Premier. References are concerned: History of Modern China by Radhesham Chaurasia, Constitution of the Peoples of China, State Councils, The Premier article by Tanvi Priya, China's Political System book by Sebastian Hillman, Constitutional Government in China, book Present Conditions and Prospects in 1922 by Westall Woodbury and Willoughby, International Organization or Modern Governments, book by Professor N.B. Patil and Professor G.B. Shilavantar. ಆಯ್ತಾ